We're continuing through the Bible this year, and I know a lot of you have been reading along. I don't know if everyone's kept the same pace, and that's okay. Wherever you are is fine. We'll just, my microphone is really hot. I'm not sure if I need to pull down a little bit, something exactly, or pull all these mics, make sure they're all muted, because I might be getting double pickup over here. But anyway, we're continuing through. We've got through most of the Old Testament now. We still have a little ways to go. We're going to get into the Chronicles. The last couple weeks I've been gone, we read several books, all of which we could take a month or two on. But we're just going to combine all those and just speed hit it today. Why not? Today we're going to hit a majority of those, not even all the ones we read. But I'm going to hit on Esther and Daniel, a couple of them from the captivity time. And then we'll look at Ezra and Nehemiah, which are really, as I'll tell you in a little bit, they're actually originally one book that tell two different stories that have been separated over time. Esther's actually kind of sandwiched in the middle of those two stories. So we'll kind of look through some of that. I love the way, and this is what I'll continue to repeat as we're doing this fast flyby, the whole Bible, is we get to see that 50,000 foot view, if you will. So we're getting to see all of it along the way. And we're going to see the story of Jesus all the way through. There's so much forecasting of what God is setting up in the New Testament. And we'll get to see that as we speed through the New Testament at the end of the year. And so hold on to your hats for that. It's going to be a bumpy ride. But we'll get there and it'll be fun. And hopefully we'll continue to pick up nuggets along the way. Today's sermon, I've titled it, I've kind of grabbed a theme from all of these together. And it's really about faith, but the battle that they go through in this, especially this time of captivity, is about fate and fear. That's what they battle. And they have to overcome that with faith. So really, it's faith above fate and fear is the title. And these are the things we'll see all the way throughout each of these books, especially as we look at Esther and Daniel. I'm going to do a little bit of comparative with them because there are a few current themes that just kind of go through both of them, and you'll kind of get a feel for that. There's this idea in Esther and in Daniel because they are captivity. Now that book is about captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. It's a little earlier, and then Esther, you have it under the Persian rule. But I want to begin with Esther. Esther is a great book. Love to just spend a ton of time on it. But we don't have that much today. We're going to hit it pretty quickly. I would encourage you to dig in to find out some more about the background of Esther. It is one of the it's kind of controversial in some ways because it doesn't, in the original Hebrew, it doesn't mention God at all. It just doesn't. And that's not the point of it. The point of it is it shows how these people rely on God without specifically mentioning him. It actually shows the power of what God does in individuals over and over again. And it actually was rewritten several times in Hebrew tradition. And you go back, and what we now have is closest to what we believe is the original form, one of the older forms. There are later books that were written and added to, a lot of commentary around it. So they brought a lot of the God speak into it because they really wanted people to see that. And I think sometimes we do that. We kind of will add some platitudes, and they added things in it that were over time were very encouraging. I don't think they were extra biblical in that manner. They were true to the manner of God, but they weren't part of the original writing. So what we have is a simplified, what we still have in our English Bible today, the story of Esther you have, is one that is very close to the original writing. And it doesn't mention the name of God. It's interesting in that regard. It is named after a woman in Esther. This tells a little bit about her plight. It enters into the story, and they are in this captivity under Persian rule. The king at the time, we know mostly as Xerxes. You'll see his name is Ahasuerus. It would have been Xerxes the first. You're going to see through all of this time of captivity, and there are a lot of these kings that had multiple names. The same guy had different names, and I was just thinking about that. Thought, man, how there's so much of that in the Bible. And then it hit me that we still do that. Even the new names of kings as they're enthroned and as they come along, they'll decide, okay, what name am I going to take as king or queen? And they might rename themselves, and it's a very common thing that's happened throughout, not just like British rule, and but across all kinds of kingdoms. And you saw that with the Persians, the Greeks did it. Caesar is more of a title than a name. There are all these different Caesars. Pharaoh, there are all these different pharaohs, and we'll talk about Pharaoh as if it's a name, but it's more of a title. And you have that a little bit with like names like Darius and Xerxes, and so a lot of them would like take that name and say, "Ooh, I like that." They would add it to it. That would be their middle name. They would put it forward, and so sometimes there's confusion about that. But I'll get to a timeline a little bit so you can kind of see how Esther and Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah, we'll look at that time period that they're in and kind of bring that out a little bit more. So a little bit of background. The first point is about Esther. Esther, it's faith in the face of fate. There's a lot of fate in the book of Esther. One of the things that comes out of the book of Esther, especially from the Hebrew calendar standpoint, is it ends up being the Feast of Purim. I don't know if you've heard of Purim before, but Purim is a feast that takes place actually more over in the springtime, but it is a huge festivity. It's a major party. It's probably the biggest feast party that the Hebrews do throughout the year, and it's based on the ending culmination of Esther. So I want to kind of roll us through a little bit of the background of what's going on. Some of the main characters in the book of Esther. She is, and if you go back and read the story, there is this King Ahasuerus. Basically, there are two things that he did through the whole story and pretty much all the history of this Xerxes the first, or Ahasuerus. And he basically just stayed drunk and just brought women in a lot. That's pretty much all he did. So it's a really super guy. And he's a foreign pagan king. And so all the Hebrew people, as well as many others, are under his rule at the time. So he's in a drunken state one time, and he's got a queen, and her Vashti, and he's like, "Bring her in. I want to show her off to everybody." She refuses to do it. So he's like, "I'm get rid of her. We're going to have a beauty pageant, and we're going to bring in all the women of the kingdom, and I'll pick some out of that herd." And so they commence to do that. And they spend months and months preparing all these women, and they parade them through. And Esther, one of the Hebrew women, this is going to be the one. I like her. And he picks a few more. Great guy. It's not a really good marriage relationship kind of book, so don't do that. It's not that kind of thing. So there's Esther. There's a guy named Haman. He is a direct descendant of a king that it tells us in the Bible that he is a direct descendant of Agag. He's an Agagite. And so Agag, if you go back in history and find out who he was a king of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were an enemy for Israel for many, many years. They come through the lineage of Esau. Amalek is a grandson of Esau, so they're an offshoot of the Amalekites. Most of the ones from Esau are the Edomites. These are Amalekites. These are Edomites, Amalekites, Moabites. They're Canaanites. All of these, the majority of these that are in that promised land are descendants and old relatives of the nation of Israel. And so these Amalekites now have been there. It's been hundreds of years since they had lineage that was common back before the nation of Israel was down in Egypt, and they came back. One of the first things that happens when they come back, if you remember the story, that they fight, one of the first groups they fight when they come in are the Amalekites, and Moses is holding up his arms, and when his arms come down, they're losing. When his arms are up, they hold up Moses' arms up, so they win the battle. They're fighting the Amalekites, so they're old relatives. Not a happy time. Thankfully, no one ever has fights with the relatives anymore. So there's all this problem. They come back in. So Haman is a descendant of that. Mordecai is another major person in here. Mordecai is a direct descendant of, it says he's from the line of Kish. Kish is Saul's father. The original Saul, the original king of Israel. And if you remember the story, Samuel was the one that anoints him. He becomes king. And so they bring Saul in, and one of the things that he does, he's supposed to get rid of the Amalekites because they've been a thorn in the side all along. There are many, many battles, and they're supposed to take out the Amalekites, take out the king. And the king at the time is Agag. So Saul brings in Agag, and he's supposed to have eliminated him. But instead, he brings him back and says, okay, we can be friends, and we'll kind of use his power because he's influence. And Samuel comes down to him, and he's like, why have you kept this guy? You're not supposed to. And he's making excuses. Same thing, he talks about, you're supposed to take out all the animals. You're not supposed to bring back. And he said, oh, no, we did that. And he said, what are the sound of all these sheep then? Like, oh, I think the people did that. So he's passing the buck. There's that story. So there's Agag who's there. And then Samuel says, you're supposed to kill him. This was what God told you to do. He's the king of the enemy. And so he doesn't do it. So Samuel takes out his sword. And it's really violent. And if they ever put this in a movie, and they have at times, and it's usually like he just stabs him. The Bible says he chops him into little pieces. So it's a pretty sight, I think. I don't know what his name was before, but I think that's what they named him afterwards. They went Agag. Anyway, probably not true. Oh, anyway. This is Mordecai's a direct descendant of Saul. Haman's a direct descendant of Agag. So now you see this story again. You have the descendants of Amalek that were related. Now you have the descendants again. It's amazing how many times, if you look through the Bible, how many times these stories meet and the significance of those. And it's easy to pass it up. Because you see lineage in the Bible and you're usually like, oh, some more begets. Let's just move on. I don't even know who these begets are. And so this was helpful background information. As the story goes, I'll try to summarize a little bit. You have Haman, who's the bad guy. He's friends with King Ahasuerus or Xerxes. And he wants to make this decree because he gets mad at Mordecai. And he's like, okay, I'm going to get rid of his whole group then because I don't like his group. So Esther 3, 7 and 9. I'll read some of that. So Esther 3, 7 and 9. I think I have that one in there, Mike. You have a slide for that one? Good. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast those are cast lots, basically rolled dice. Before Haman, day after day. They cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So what they did is they cast these lots, and they're wanting to put down and they're putting together their calendar. Basically, the first year is like, this is what we're going to do on those dates. And he's looking for a time where he can put on his calendar where he's going to take out the Jews, is really what this is about. So Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. Not so a drunken Ahasuerus said, yeah, whatever, bud. And so he puts out a decree. So one of the things that you'll see common in a lot of these stories, especially when they're under foreign rule, is there are decrees put out by the king. The king is thought of to be a sovereign. That is, he's all powerful, and whatever he says is basically, okay, it's like the gods have spoken, and whatever he says is always right. So whatever he says is true and good, and he decrees it, it's law, we'll do it. They planned it out about a year out in advance, and like, okay, on this date, we'll just take them all out. And they need to put it pretty far out because, it wasn't exactly like everyone had a cell phone. Hey, let everybody know, So they send the Pony Express out, they get the word out, and so it takes a little while, and they've got a plan that all the Jews will be taken out on this date. So the decree goes out. The word gets back to Mordecai and Esther, like, what are we going to do? The king doesn't even know that she's part of this group. He's clueless about that. And so they said, well, it's a tough time. And there's a biblical scripture that a lot of you have probably heard that there's an encouragement to Esther that, you know what? I think you were born for such a time as this. And that's, wow, okay, such a time as this. A rough time. This is a tough story. And she's in the middle of that. And that's the word that comes to her for the plans that God has for her. So these are cast, the lots are cast, the time is set, the decree is made, and things are in a process. I want to take a second and talk about just this whole idea of casting of lots, throwing of dice. Several of you are probably familiar with, and in Jewish culture, there is what they have, and you'll usually see it at Hanukkah, and it's a dreidel. And that's kind of basically like a fancy or different form of dice. It's a top with 4 square sides. I think I have a picture of that. Did I put that in there, Mike? I think I did. Hopefully I did. You see a picture in there? That's it. All right. So there, on the right side of this picture, you'll see each of the 4 sides that can land. There's a Nun, Shin, Gimel, and Hai. Those are just 4 letters. Now, without going into great detail, what would happen in the dreidel is a little different than maybe what they did at the time, but there was this idea of casting lots, throwing dice kind of idea of what is the outcome going to be. In this particular instance with the dreidel, you have each of these, whatever it lands on, there's a game that they would play, and it's actually a pagan game that the Hebrews took up, and I'll tell you the reason why they did it in a little bit. But the pagan game is this, and they even play it, and they'll really only play it at Christmas or Hanukkah for them, that time of year. And the kids, particularly, they spin the top, the dreidel, it falls, it lands on one of these. And so there's a big pot, and they have like these chocolate coins, and they'll put them in. So depending on what it lands on, you can either do nothing, you can add a piece to the pot, you can take half the pot, or you get all the pot. And then they just keep playing this game. And this was this idea of the dreidel. Each of these letters, the Nun, Shin, Gimel, Hai, actually for them, the reason they put it together that way, it comes out to Nes Gadol Hayach Sham, which is a great miracle has happened. That miracle they refer to at Hanukkah is the miracle of, if you go deep into it, this is from the intertestamental period. They're about 400 years from the time of Micah ends until Jesus comes. There's this intertestamental period. And one of the groups that's in there are these Maccabees, these people that come along, these strong Jewish people, and they go through some different wars and stuff. And at one point, they have a menorah, and you see that big candelabra that they have with candles on it, and they would do it with the oil. And so there's a story about how they never ran out of oil during this time. Without going into detail, that's the miracle it talks about. So they spin the dreidel at that time. The reason they did that, and the funny thing about the dreidel, or the casting of lots of die, and just the fate of the idea of the story, they did it because they were hiding what they were actually doing to the people that would come in, and the ones that were ruling over them, because it was illegal for them to get together and worship. So they would hide their worship by playing this game of chance. And so when they would show up, they would have this game going on, and go, oh, they're just gambling, leave them alone. And they would just have that going, but they were actually doing worship service. That would be their quick way of covering it up. Which reminded me, and I wanted to put that in there for today's, even though it's not necessarily what's going on with Esther, but there is this history of chance and fate that all these pagan nations would put in there. And so their use of that whole dreidel idea is just a cover-up for what they really were doing, and that was worshiping. I've been on a couple different missionary trips where we actually had to hide what we were doing in the face of opposition. One of which we were in Vietnam, and under communist rule, and we were in a big house church, and they set the whole thing up with us all sitting at tables, and they put a little bit of food out, just some snacks and water and stuff, and they said, well, the communist rule could come at any time. We've heard that they've already have wind of our service, so we'd have different people stand up at the head table and talk. But if they showed up, we were supposed to just sit back down, and we're having a dinner party, and they would leave us alone. That was basically kind of like this. It was a cover-up for what's going on. So the whole idea, the reason that the original idea of doing this pagan game for them, the dreidel, was to cover up the worship service that they had was going on. In Esther, they are casting lots, and they use the pur, and they're looking for and deciding on, and Haman believes that he is deciding on the fate of the Jewish people. So that when this date hits, which they end up calling Purim later on, the whole plan changes. And so let's look at that for a minute. So let's look at Esther 4:16. Esther 4:16. So Esther and Mordecai, they get word that this thing's going to go down, and they're like, okay, it's not good. All the Jews will be killed on a day. So what are we going to do? And so this is the word. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will, this is Esther talking, will also fast as you do. She's talking to Mordecai. Then I'll go to the king, and though it is against the law, if I perish, I perish. So this was for such a time as this. She actually is now part of she has access to the king, but she can only come when summoned. And she knows that if she goes there without being summoned, that he has the right to not only refuse her, but to actually have her executed. So it's a dangerous thing. This crazy, drunken guy who's the king at the time, Xerxes Ahasuerus, and she's like, I'm going to give it a shot, because, what else are we going to do? And so she's going to go see him. And she does. And so then the plot kind of rolls out. So I'm going to try to summarize that at the time too. So she goes to Ahasuerus and she says, look, there's a bad deal going on, and there's my people are supposed to be killed on this date, and he says, well, that's a bad deal, let's not do that. And he said, oh, the decree was already put out, and that's actually part of my people. And he goes, oh, bad deal, so let's not do that. So they end up reversing the decree, and he can't take the decree away, by the way, because he's now he doesn't make mistakes. These guys don't make mistakes. So he just sends out 2 more decrees to he said, okay, here's the first one. The Jews all have the right to fight back, and they can kill anyone that's trying to kill them. And by king's decree, you can go ahead and try to pull off and go after them if you want to, but you're going to be the ones that get killed instead. And so the day comes, and that becomes the day of Purim, and they get to take out anybody that was against them. And he said, I'm going to do another decree. He said, is it okay? He said, well, still a little bit more. And he said, okay, here's the other decree. Anybody that you found out that was plotting, that you found out, you sleuthed out, that anybody was out there, just go ahead and chase them down and take them out too. And then they do. That becomes the basis for the Feast of Purim. What was decreed by the hand of evil turned into a decree that became, or a declaration that ultimately became by, and they saw it as the grace of God in the midst of craziness. It's a crazy time. It is a weird deal. But God actually took what Satan meant for evil, what Haman meant for evil, and reversed it. Mordecai, there's more to the story. It's pretty cool. He gets to ascend. He is recognized for some great things he did. And Haman, the bad guy, ends up being killed in the gallows or the torture stake that he intended for Mordecai. Super short version of that story. I'd love to spend more time on it, but I really want to move on. There is this idea that comes out of Esther because of this idea of Purim and fate, and the idea that a lot of people just believe that everything's happening by fate, but instead God operates by faith. And even if, like she said, I don't know, if I perish, if I die, I die. That doesn't negate that God is God. It's worth the risk, and she does it in faith. She doesn't know. She believes that God has a plan bigger than her, but she goes. Even in the face of fear, she goes. So there you have that part. So there's this story you may have heard that some people say that luck or fate is when opportunity meets with preparation. And you've maybe heard this story that sometimes opportunity comes and knocks, and you've got to be ready when opportunity knocks. And so there's this idea of readiness. And you might have heard this before. I've heard it, and it's just an interesting one. There's a new pastor in a town. He goes and he's knocking. He's going around trying to meet the people that are part of the congregation. He's knocking on doors, and once he misses, he leaves his card. And so he decides it's kind of cute. He leaves a card, and it just says, I got the reference here. Revelation 3:10. That's the one. And so they go read Revelation 3:10. It says, I knock. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And so he left that. And so one door he knocked on, he gets back to church on Sunday, and somebody brought the card back. And at the bottom of it, they put Genesis 3:10. So I looked up Genesis 3:10, and it says, I was naked and ashamed, so I hid myself. So be ready when opportunity knocks. I don't know. That's bad. Anyway, okay. Point 2, the second part, we're going to look at, now we're going to look at the book of Daniel. We're actually kind of going back in time a little bit to look at Daniel. And this is faith in the face of fire. Faith in the face of fire. It's kind of where the picture comes from. That's a picture of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into the fire. And on the title screen, I've added the cross in the background because, as you remember the story, and we'll get to it, they're thrown into the fire by Nebuchadnezzar, and they go on in great faith. So let me do some background on this one. So like Esther, Daniel's also a time of captivity. It's several years before Esther took place. They're actually in Babylonian captivity. This is the first captivity that the Hebrew people are under in the rulership of Babylon. The Persians come after that. So these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, they're in the book of Daniel, are all Hebrews that were taken at a younger age, and they are raised under the king because they have great wisdom. He's incorporated them. They have favor, not because they really want to use the advantage of anybody that they've taken in slavery. And these guys are part of that, but they are noted for their abilities. But they come against some opposition. They come against some decrees. They come against some hard times. And then I want to read Daniel 2:11. Let me give you some background of this before I read that. So Daniel, one of the characters in the story, he has several things that happen with him. One of which is the king has this nightmare one night, and he's freaking out about it. And he doesn't know what it means, and he's scared. And he needs somebody to tell him what it means. So he gathers up all these wise guys he has in his kingdom, and says, I need somebody to tell me what my dream means. They said, okay, well, king, go ahead and just tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you what it means. He said, oh, no. Anybody can do that. And I want you to tell me what my dream was, and then tell me what it means. And they're like, well, no one can do that. And this is the verse. The thing that the king asks is difficult. No one can show it to the king except the God whose dwelling is not with flesh. So they believed in a lot of different gods, and they were soothsayers, and they were tricksters, much like what happened in Egypt. They had the ability to do some stuff, and by dark powers and trickery, whatever, they were able to do some of this stuff. Well, they brought in Daniel and the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They brought in some of these from foreigners. Like, these guys are pretty smart, so we want to use them. Word gets back to Daniel that the king is so mad. He says, you know what, I'm just going to kill everybody that's part of my wisdom group here, and we're just going to start over. You're all going to die. And he's part of that group, so he says, that's not a good idea. So he prays about it to see what God has to say, and the Lord just gives him the dream, reveals it to him, and he goes to the king, and he tells him, hey, this is what your dream was, and this is what it means, and pretty much saves everybody in that deal. So it's amazing to see God at work in there. And again, the king has put out a decree like, everyone dies if you can't figure this out. And then God gives it to Daniel. And even those other guys, the other soothsayers, the other wisdom guys he has around him, they're like, nobody can do this. There's no, it have to be revealed directly by the gods. And so they're like, oh wow, pretty cool. Daniel has got a tap in here. But they don't like that. There's always opposition looking to take anyone out that's kind of climbing the ladder. And so again, like in Esther, there is a group that come, they talk to the king, and they say, hey, there are some guys out there that they're not like us, and they don't follow your rules, and we should take them out. And they point out Daniel because he doesn't eat right, and they said he should be eating the king's meals, and when they go to him and they say, hey, you should be eating the way we're eating, he says, I've got a way I'm supposed to be eating according to my God, and he continues to eat that way. And it's kind of interesting because it's like, hey, I'm vegetarian, you guys are omnivores or carnivores, and I don't eat the way you do. And they said, well, you're just going to perish if not. And they said, oh, let me just keep eating the way I do. We'll see which one gets fatter. And I'm like, oh, wow. So he got fat, and they were like, that's really cool. So fat was healthy. That's great. No, his body didn't waste away, and they're like, okay. But they continue to not bow down. There's a decree put out. You've got to bow down when we play the trumpets and we play these musical instruments. You're supposed to follow what we have to follow. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are they're challenged. They're the ones that are brought in to say, hey, these guys, they're not following the king's decree because they talked him into putting out another decree. And that is that they'll play these different instruments at different times, and everybody's got to bow down. And they're like, we're not doing that. And they said, okay, well, you need to go to the furnace then, which is not a good thing. And so he's wanting to throw these guys into the fiery furnace. Let me read to you what Daniel 3:17 and 18 says about that. Daniel 3:17 and 18. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. He'll deliver us out of your hand, king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. He put up this giant, tall, golden image. He was talking to that. They played music at a certain time of day. Everybody had to bow down. And they're like, we don't do that. We don't worship anyone but our God. And so they get to this part, and they're going to be thrown into this fiery furnace, which is like a giant oven with a hole in the top. And he's so mad because they said they're still not going to do it. He says, heat it 7 times hotter, which is pretty much impossible. It'd be like the surface of the sun. In fact, he was just saying, just get this thing as hot as we can. The guys that go to throw them in, if you remember the story, it cooks those guys, and they die. But then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just go right on into the fire. And as they're in the fire and they're walking around, nothing's happening. They're looking like, how in the world are these guys walking around in this fire when the guys who couldn't even get close to it are being killed? And they're like, okay, something's going on there. And the king looks, Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, he's pretty impressed. So these guys are walking around. If you ever watch VeggieTales, I always love that line. And there is like, well, there's 3 guys went in, and there are 4 in there now, and one of them is really shiny. So that was Jesus, basically. And I just love the fact that God just shows up. I love what they say, though. They're like, look, it's like Esther said. I said, I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I don't know if I'm going to live or not. If I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going into the fiery furnace. God's able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, and we don't know, even if he does not, that means nothing. We still know that God is for us, and we'll go. We'll gladly go, and we won't bow down because we're not trusting in the right outcome according to what we think, but the fact that God has us no matter the outcome. No matter what that future holds or what the steps look like to get there, I'm not concerned about my way. I'm going to take the Lord's way, and that outcome could be totally different. I'm just going to be obedient to that in that moment. And that is a strong message that both of these are giving. There's so much more in both of these books I would love to get into, but I'm not. So we're going to be moving on. There was a Sunday school teacher that had her kids in Sunday school, and she told the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they said, why do you think when they went into that fire that they were not burned up? And one little boy says, well, Jesus was in there, and Jesus is cool. So there's that. Hey, the boy said it, not me. It's all right? All right. So now we'll go on to Ezra. Ezra and Nehemiah, as I mentioned before, is actually originally one book. It's over a long period of time, but it is about the people coming back into the land. They're coming back into the land, and they are rebuilding the temple, and they're rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. There's a lot that goes into this story, but I want to grab a couple of things. I want us to now take a look at this timeline I mentioned before, but I've got a couple different shots of the timeline. If you can see all this, I'm not sure if you can. I've got a one that's a little bit bigger and written differently, but I want you to kind of see some of the periods on here. So the fall of Jerusalem on the far left, it happens. You've got it over there in the timeline, like 585. You're spanning about 170, 80 years here from end to end. In the middle of that, you have several things that take part. Each of the ones we're looking at today, Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah. And if we put Daniel on there, it would be back on the far left side of that line because they're under Babylonian captivity when this first happens. But the books we're about to look at, we have the first half of Ezra that happens, and this is the first time they go in. And it's the story of about a guy named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the first leader that brings them back into the promised land. There is a decree by a king that's given, Cyrus at that time, that says, yes, go, do that. And there's a break in there, and I'll read about that again in a minute, but the temple is finally completed a little later. Esther happens in the middle of this timeline. It's off in a different area where it's going on. And she is going on. This is King Xerxes. I'll show you the other timeline in a minute. Then you have the latter part of Ezra. They return, and this time it's all about the worship and religious reforms. And then we have the book of Nehemiah, which overlaps with that. And they go back and they finish the city, the walls, and all that go around. So there's a long period of time that's going on in each of these books. Now go to the second slide. I have another timeline slide. I think you can see it a little bit better this way. This is just Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. So you have the rebuilding of the temple, the first part. Then you have Esther. It's kind of taken apart in the middle. If you look at the very bottom, the first king there was Cyrus the second. Then you have Darius, Xerxes the first, and Artaxerxes is kind of the timeline of all of that. Again, the names get a little bit convoluted sometimes with some of these kings, because some of them would take a name that wasn't their birth name, was their middle name, and sometimes it's kind of like someone said, well, under Caesar, and you're like, okay, which one? Or under Pharaoh, and that's just a bit more like a title, and sometimes these names became more like titles. You can see how the other prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, kind of coincide. We read those earlier in the year, and we referenced this time at that time, and so this is what all is going on. It helps to know, because there is, all the way through this is all about captivity. There is the beginning part's Babylonian, then there's Persian. And there's also this, each of these kings along there, as you see, some are really helpful and really agreeable to the Hebrew people to help them out. Like Cyrus is like, yeah, go on back. And by the time you get down here to Artaxerxes, by the time he's convinced, he really helps them out later on. But some come in and they're like, we're not on our side, and then others are on their side. Xerxes is Ahasuerus. They're in the middle. Xerxes, that we talked about under Esther, is also called Ahasuerus. Lots of double names, lots of differentiation along those lines. So the work began in 536 BC of the temple. The temple, it was all halted. And I talked about this when we went through this portion earlier this year. There was opposition, and the opposition's interesting. So the people return to this Jerusalem area, and they're mainly the group that were the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, and a remnant of those that were put into captivity. And they've tried to keep their genealogy together, know who they are, and so they go back to the area. Well, there are some people that were never left the area. They were part mostly of the northern kingdoms, what becomes Samaritans, and which, if you know in the New Testament later on, they're not friends with each other. Those that came from the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, fought each other a lot. There are 10 tribes in the north and only 2 tribes in the south. The southern kingdom lasted longer until it fell. That's where Jerusalem was. And that becomes a place they're going back to try to reset up. So some of these Jews that are dispersed, disbanded, they kind of want to come in and say, hey, no, we want to help. And they're not about it. They're like, no, we can't totally figure out your lineage, and we're not sure. I know you didn't get baptized the same way we got baptized. Some dunk and some sprinkle, and we use a cup and you use it. No, that's modern. No, never mind. We still have these crazy issues that we have, and we always have with religion and differences. And a lot of it, honestly, we fight about denominationally are things that are minutia, I think, in the kingdom of God, and get us tripped up. And so I think we're seeing more people come back together, and you'll see the arc of during that 400-year span when they're under captivity of people realizing that they need to come together at different times. But even by the time that Jesus shows up on the scene, a lot of the religious leaders are the ones he had the most problem with. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the lawmakers, and he fought them more than he did what would be considered secular people. And I think he's always calling from the highways and the byways to come back in. I just want to say this about Ezra and Nehemiah. Some of these they're not always heroic in what they're doing. We look at that sometimes and we say, oh, well, a lot of this was not issued by God. There's a story about how there's a decree that goes out basically among them, like we need to purify. We're so convoluted with all these pagans that have come and been a part of us, which God said don't intermarry. But now they were very interspersed. And they look at it and say, okay, well, we've got to fix that. So we're going to make everyone divorce anybody that wasn't originally part of our group. But that wasn't given by God. In fact, in the book of Malachi, which is here on the end, he says God hates divorce. He doesn't want divorce. That's not his idea. There's got to be a better way to get through that. Even though there was this decree that they put out, they thought this would solve things. Sometimes we come up with these ideas. They're human ideas. We pass them off and we put out decrees just like pagan kings do. Instead of going to God in each individual time and say, God, what are you doing right now? And how can we get through this at such a time as this, like Esther? And when we face problems, or what are we going to do? And we sit down and we stop and we call on God. When that timeline, they had the work that began 536. They had their bickering in 520. They halted it, but they came back and they completed it in 516. And that's when they completed the temple. That's just the temple, the middle part. They still have the host city that was destroyed some time ago when the Babylonians came in over time. And so let's take a look at Ezra 3:11. Ezra 3:11 gives us one of the things that happens during this time in the book of Ezra that we don't want to lose along the way. It says this: they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. We actually have a song we sing at times like, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. We sing that. His love endures forever. And it comes from this. There are a couple other places that you can find the same ideas in the Bible, but there was a recognition not only for Ezra that they needed to rebuild the temple, but the more important thing was that they needed to have a sense of worship about it. That the rebuilding of that temple was more about what was going on inside of them. There were several that moaned and groaned, like, okay, we're rebuilding this thing, but we remember some of the ones that had been around from long ago, like, y'all don't even know what the temple was like. Back in the day, it was awesome, and this is not the same, and man, I wish we had a big old nice place like that. You should have seen it. And they realized that the greater thing is, and there's a reform to build the temple, but then there's also a reform, a religious reform, if you will, a personal reform for the people to come back to the heart of worship, to realize what the greater thing was. There was a time that they knew that the presence of God showed up in the temple and like smoke and it filled, and there were times where God showed up and the earth opened and they were looking for that. And there was a charge to them, like, don't look towards that kind of stuff, but rather a relationship with worship. And there is a kind of a story that goes along with this, and this is that third point about Ezra, and it is faith in the face of delays. And I may have mentioned that or skipped the title, but this is about faith in the face of delays. So that's what was going on with Ezra. They go back. It took them some time. They got a decree. They got started. They were stopped again. They got started again. They got more of it done, and then they were sad about what they did, and they felt delayed. They felt defeated, and it just wasn't the same. And God's like, don't focus on that, and He gives them back this heart of worship. So that's what goes on. So there's sometimes in our life what you may in your own life. I mean, how many times have you maybe been at your job and you're tired of your work, and then God reminds you? There's a lot of people that don't have a job will be really happy. Or maybe you remember when you prayed for that job and you got it, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's good. Or you're eating a meal and you're like, man, I don't really like what there's nothing I want today. Where do you want to go eat? I don't know. There's nowhere to eat in this town. And then you're reminded there are people all over the world that won't eat a single meal today, even though they wish that they could. and how grateful we are to live at, like Esther, at such a time as this. I mean, we're not under pagan rule where we're oppressed, that we're afraid someone's going to come through the door at any moment and stop us at gunpoint from worshiping God. We're really blessed. Sadly, sometimes when you have great freedom, we just don't show up. I mean, we could go do what we want to do. And, when we lived in Florida, pretty days were difficult days because people would just go to the beach. I love the beach. I get it. But sometimes those were the hard. It was funny because if it was a rainy day, you'd have people show up. It's kind of opposite here. And so you had all that. Point 4, let's get on to Nehemiah before I get too long-winded here. Nehemiah is the last book that we'll cover today. And this is faith in the face of opposition. So the opposition just kept coming. And they had, like I said before, you had in Ezra, you had a group that opposed them. You have it again in Nehemiah. So much so that they were getting together, and there were people that said they were going to come and attack them. If they kept doing the work, they would take them out. And so they have this really cool story that goes along there of how they build. Let me read Nehemiah 6:9. And I'm going to read another one after that. Nehemiah 6:9. They all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from their work. It'll not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. So there's opposition that was coming and threatening and frightening and saying, don't do that. If you do, we'll stop you. And just the threats and the thought. And we still have people in opposition to us to this day. So you had Nehemiah up against that. This great opposition about rebuilding. There's another verse from Nehemiah. And this is Nehemiah 4. Put the next one up there, 16 to 18. From that day on, half of my servants worked on the construction. Half held spears and shields and bows and coats of mail. The leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall, and those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand held of his weapon, and with the other, and each of the builders had his sword strapped to his side while he built. So there's this picture of this idea that they were armed. They were armed with weapons. They had their DeWalt kit on one side and their AR on the other, and they were just slaving away. They realized that they were building, but they were under constant threat. There was an enemy pressing in, and they just said, you know what, we're just going to go forward. Their prayer was that God would be with them in it, and He was. I think it's interesting how God did two things. God could have, by His miraculous power, just built the temple. It's like, oh, there it is, and He could have done that, but He used people for that, and He could have just removed the opposition, but instead He allowed them to be bold in the midst of that opposition. They were armed on one side, they were building on the other. They were about the work that God had planned in front of them. It's at a time that we're not in a time like that. I mean, we have opposition. What we think of as persecution is not much in comparison to what they faced. I mean, we have Democrats and Republicans that don't like each other, but so far, we're not in civil war. But there are things that we have in different oppositions along the way. We have different ideas all through our society. We have different denominations. We have our world, I think, at this point is churning. The enemy is out there accusing, and he works in individual families, individuals all along the way, for us to focus on what's best for me and how is this other hurting me, and how do I win that situation, as opposed to a love which says, I'm going to love God and I'm going to risk relationship, even at such a time as this. Even if it doesn't work out the way that I have planned, I'm going to trust God for the other side. If opposition comes to a point where I have to face death, so be it. Even if even if that's how it turns out, that is not even, if I go to the fiery furnace and I perish like Esther, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Daniel. They threw him in the lion's den, and there were all these hungry lions, and he made it through the night. And he gets the next day, and then again they throw the other guys in, and they get killed immediately. God has a plan in the midst of the problems. When we face opposition, and we always do in various ways. How beautiful are these stories, though, to show us these extreme levels of opposition. Yet we have a mighty God who is able to save through more than all of that. And His salvation is not just about our plan going our way. You know, some of the times it doesn't go the way we think. The whole book of Job, he's praying along the way, and things do not go well. And the end of that story is God is still God. And His ways are higher than our ways, and He knows better than we know, and there's a level of trust because He's not just focused on the now, but He's eternal. And we're eternal, and He's made us that way, and He has a great plan for us going forward. From that day on, they worked one hand on the shovel, one hand on the weapon. They were just taking care of. They were troweling out the walls. They were building, and they were giving glory to God. Didn't mean that they didn't have trouble, didn't have mess ups. In fact, the whole book of Nehemiah ends, and the people are kind of slipping back into being ungodly again. And Nehemiah's kind of like, "Oh God, I tried." And I think there's something even for us to learn from that, and that is that we can't try hard enough to make things work out. We just trust in the midst of it, and even if it's not going the way we see, we still trust God for the outcome. And it may be generations down the line. Now, what they had no clue of is they were building a temple, and they were working on something that would ultimately be the place where God did show up again. And then He came, and it was even glorified and built so much more and stuff by Herod. And ultimately there would be a temple where Jesus walked, and God was there. And even the people that were there at the time that He came, they didn't know that the glory was in that temple more than they would ever know. And we look back at that and say, what an amazing time. But even think about this. Jesus is still alive and well today. He is still in the opposition, and He still fills temples. And that temple, He says, is us. And we have the opportunity to have a prepared place that He would come. We say for such a time as this, and we prepare our temple so that it would come. We oppose that which is not of God, and we build for that which we want. We do things in the natural, like we're rebuilding a place where we can meet, and we're really looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to not being in the hallway again. That will be nice. But Jesus shows up even now, and not just in this building, but as we leave. And how good is that story? So let me give you some concluding summarization of kind of what we've walked through today, that we can just remember what we did. So Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, there's one thread. Faith rises above fear and faith. And Esther, fate was rolled, but faith stood firm. That was the whole thing about fate. And Daniel, the decrees were issued, but faith was declared, even if not. Even if not, you throw me in the fire and God will be with you. But even if not, God is still God. No matter what the decrees of the world and the laws of this world change, Amen. God is bigger than the laws of this world and rulers here. Ezra, delays come. Why can't we get this done? Why can't we get this sanctuary built in just a couple days? Back on July 4th, we said, maybe it'll be a few weeks. Boy, it has been a few weeks, has it not? But Faith kept singing. Glory and worship is what God's about. In Nehemiah, opposition, it's going to come. It's going to press in. But faith keeps building. That's what God does. Practical advice that goes along with that. I created that as well. When life is random, trust God's purpose. When decrees are against you, laws of the land, pray for God's intervention. When delays discourage you, sing anyway. And when opposition rises, just keep building with faith. The greatest thing you have is your faith in the Lord Jesus and to call to Him to come. Amen? Amen. Amen.